Mrs. Lincoln, the president, was in a very happy mood during their discussion. Well, at, excuse me, at 8:30 a.m., Kennedy met with his presidential aides, Kenneth O'Donnell and Lawrence O'Brien, in his hotel suite. At 8:30, the president met with two of his aides. We've talked about it before, Kenneth O'Donnell and Lawrence O'Brien. Here's a picture of Lawrence O'Brien right here. For those that maybe not see it, this is what this guy looked like. He, Kenneth O'Donnell, and David Powers, remember, were the president's closest aides. And it just so happened that that morning that Kennedy met in his hotel suite with both O'Donnell and O'Brien. Now it's kind of interesting because all three kind of looked out a window of the suite towards a parking lot. There was a big parking lot right outside the president's suite. So he's up in his suite and he's looking down and he sees this big parking lot outside the hotel. And it was being set up. Okay, and what I mean by that is the president was supposed to speak to 2,500 people that were lucky to get tickets at the Chamber of Commerce breakfast. But there were a lot of people who did not get tickets, and Kennedy made arrangements to get the parking lot set up so he could go out and speak for a few minutes to those people that were fortunate enough to get tickets before he departed and went into the ballroom of the Hotel Texas to give a speech. So he was campaigning, wasn't he? Okay, so O'Brien and O'Donnell, the president, are looking down at this window towards the parking lot. The parking lot was being set up so Kennedy could address a group of people who weren't lucky enough to secure a ticket to the breakfast that morning. So the president was going to get the most out of his day. So people that gathered there were going to be able to get in the parking lot and listen to him speak. Now, after what happened during that day, a lot of people, you're going to hear me say, were later quoted as saying this, or were later quoted as saying that, because they reflected on the day after it happened. And this is what O'Brien was later quoted as saying about the conversation he had with President Kennedy that morning. So they're all looking down towards that parking lot, right? And this was O'Brien's recollection of that moment. He said, "That morning I had been visiting with the president in his suite in Fort Worth, and as was rather typical of him, he walked over to the window and put his foot up on the ledge of the window and cupped his chin in his hands with his elbow on his knee and was looking down at the preparations being completed for his outdoor appearance. And he said to me, quote, 'Gosh, when you look out like this and down at where I'm going to be, if someone wanted to get you, it wouldn't be difficult, would it?' We didn't dwell on it at all, obviously, but it apparently touched his mind at the moment. Perhaps he had never been in a similar position looking down on the location of a public appearance he was going to make and realizing how open the view was from the window." That was O'Brien's recollection of that time, that the president actually made a comment that it wouldn't be difficult to get him from a venue like that. Well, at 8:40 a.m., the president left his hotel suite, and what do you think he did in reference to what we've talked about so far? What do you do at 8:40 briefly? Talks to Mrs. Lincoln's friends in the hallway. So at 8:40, good Allison, at 8:40, he left his hotel suite and met with Mrs. Lincoln's friends in the hallway like he had promised. And of course, she was there. And she was later quoted as saying this about that moment during the day. She said, "He gave the usual pleasantries. He said that he was pleased to meet them and that any friends of mine were friends of his. He then looked out of the window and commented about how many people were down below. The size of the crowd pleased him." So now he looked out towards the parking lot and people are starting to fill, getting ready for his outdoor speech. Okay? Well, at 8:45 he went outside to the platform and began preparations for what we call his parking lot speech. So at 8:45, the president went outside to the parking lot to perform his speech. And guess who he was joined by? Who else was at the podium standing and listening, facing the crowd when he spoke in that parking lot? Who else was there? No? That's a good point, though. We're going to get to that. Who else was there? Think about his mission. Who was standing right next to him as he gave the speech on both sides? Vice President Johnson, Senator Yarborough, and Governor Conway. All three he had on the podium with him, the stage, excuse me, with him, as he stood at the podium and gave his speech. He was making a point here. So as he stepped up to the podium in that kind of makeshift platform for him to speak to the people in the parking lot, he had on both sides of him a combination of Vice President Lyndon Johnson, Senator Yarborough, and Governor Connolly. Now, the president took the podium, began to speech, and the crowd kind of interrupted him with a chant. They weren't coughing in cadence. They weren't walking down the aisles with flags upside down. They weren't stomping their feet. They were chanting, "Jackie, Jackie, Jackie, Jackie." I mean, to the point where he really couldn't speak, because taking what Mary said into consideration, because you'd probably think Jackie was with him, she wasn't. But the people were pretty interested in seeing her. And so as he's trying to begin his speech, the crowd out there is yelling, "Jackie, Jackie, Jackie." And the president, kind of smiled because he liked that. And he apologized to the crowd because Jackie wasn't there. And this is what he said to the crowd. He said, quote, "Mrs. Kennedy is organizing herself. It takes her longer, but of course she looks better than we do when she does." And he gets a big hand for that. And Mrs. Kennedy had not planned to take part in the chamber breakfast either. Okay? But the president could see by this reaction that she would be a big asset and the people wanted to see her. So what he did is, after he gave his speech in the parking lot, he got the word to Secret Service agent Clint Hill to go back to the hotel and let Jackie know that he wanted her to join him at the head table at the Grand Ballroom of the Hotel Texas when he gave that speech in just a few minutes. So when he could see the reaction the people had for Jackie, he gave the word to Clint Hill, who was a Secret Service agent, to go back to the hotel and let Mrs. Kennedy know that her husband wanted her to join him at the head table at the Chamber of Commerce breakfast speech at the Hotel Texas Ballroom. She was not planning on attending that. He was going to give the speech himself. But again, the president could tell what was up here, and he asked Clint Hill to go get her. Who is Clint Hill, other than a Secret Service agent? He will become one of the most visible men in American history here in a couple of hours in history. He was Jackie Kennedy's personal Secret Service agent. He is the one that his job was to protect the First Lady. That's what he does. And you'll see hear much more about him as we go. So again, as a result of the crowd's eagerness to see Jackie, the president sent word to Secret Service agent Clint Hill to go back to the hotel and request that Jackie join her husband at the head table of the Grand Ballroom of the Hotel Texas that morning. So Kennedy gives his short speech to the people in the parking lot. He leaves and he enters the ballroom inside the Hotel Texas at about 9 a.m. So he gives his speech, and at 9 a.m. he's heading into the ballroom to give his official speech in front of those guests that we had talked about. Now here's an interesting story. Write down what you want. What is that breakfast attended by mainly? Who's there? Who's there to listen to the president? Who do you think? Opposite. Actually, it cost a lot of money to get in there, so it was full of a ton of wealthy Republicans, ironically. Most who obviously did not vote for the president in 1960. So ironically, the breakfast was attended by mainly wealthy Republicans. And obviously, most of those wealthy Republicans were not people that voted for the president in 1960. Now you talk about politics. A few days prior to the breakfast, do you think the Secret Service had a list of who was there? Guess who? Guess what population was not at all represented? What demographics was not represented at all? Who didn't have a ticket?
Extremists.
No. Not one black person had a ticket to that banquet. So the Kennedy administration noticed that there were no black people invited. So they sent word to a local prominent black man who lived in Fort Worth and made arrangements that he could bring 50 black guests to the breakfast. because the president wasn't interested in speaking to a bunch of wealthy Republicans without a little bit of demographic equality. So someone within the Kennedy administration got a hold of a prominent black man who lived in the Fort Worth area, supplied him with 50 tickets, and asked him to go out and get some people to come. So there were actually some African Americans there once the arrangements were made. Now, when the president arrived and got to the head table, he was entertained by the Texas Boys Choir of Fort Worth. He was entertained by the Texas Boys Choir of Fort Worth. And they were scheduled to sing one song for him. You ever heard "The Eyes of Texas Are Upon You"? The eyes of Texas are upon you. I know you'll hear it in the video, but that was the one song they were scheduled to perform for the president. Okay, so he came in, stood up. They start, and the Texas Boys Choir of Fort Worth, who were handpicked to perform for the president, were scheduled to sing just one song, "The Eyes of Texas Are Upon You." But they ended up having to sing another one. Why? No. Jackie wasn't there, stalling for time because he wanted Jackie there. So the word got to the Texas Boys Choir, let's have another, okay? Because Mrs. Kennedy's not here yet. So after the president arrived, he was entertained by the Texas Boys Choir of Fort Worth. They were handpicked to perform for the president, and they were scheduled to sing just one song, "The Eyes of Texas Are Upon You," but they actually sang another as they stalled for time as the president waited for Mrs. Kennedy to arrive. Well, they get done with the second song, no Mrs. Kennedy. So they introduced Vice President Lyndon Johnson to the crowd, and he speaks a little bit to try to get some time consumed for her to get there. So Vice President Lyndon Johnson's introduced because he's from Texas after all, right? Senator from Texas, he's an important man there. So they introduce him and he speaks for a while, still waiting for Mrs. Kennedy to get there. Well, he gets done speaking and they're kind of looking around a little bit, and finally, just before the president is introduced to speak, Mrs. Kennedy made her appearance at the grand ballroom. And who is she escorted by? Clint Hill. And when she walks in the door with Clint Hill, she receives a standing ovation from the 2,500 guests there. And I have a really cool picture here. It took me a long time to get. And this is a picture signed by Clint Hill of the exact picture of him walking Mrs. Kennedy into the ballroom at that moment. This is a really cool picture. This took me a lot of effort to try to find something like this. But this is a picture of Clint Hill and Mrs. Kennedy as she walked into the hotel room. And when she walked in that door, 2,500 guests stood and gave her a standing ovation. Was the president's intuition good in getting her to come? No question about it. Okay? Well, Jackie was dressed in a strawberry pink suit with a nubby weave and a purplish blue collar. I'll tell you why I'm getting into detail. Jackie Kennedy, when she arrives at the Hotel Texas Ballroom, she's dressed in a strawberry pink suit with a nubby weave and a purplish blue collar. What's a nubby weave? I'll show you this. It's just a little weave you can see. Why do I make you pass that around? Why do I make that so evident in your mind? Because during the course of this day, that dress will stand out like you won't believe. Okay, and we'll talk about that later. So she arrives dressed in a strawberry pink suit with a nubby weave and a purplish blue collar. When Mrs. Kennedy got seated, the president was then introduced, and this is how he began his speech. He has a great wit about him. It's not belly laugh wit, but it's good. Here's what he said. You don't have to write down, just again, listen. He said, "Ladies and gentlemen, 2 years ago, I said, that I introduced myself in Paris by saying I was the man who accompanied Mrs. Kennedy to Paris. I'm getting somewhat that same sensation as I travel around Texas." When he was in Paris prior to this, the same thing happened to him. And the people were just going nuts over Jackie, and so he basically told the people in Paris that he was the man who accompanied Mrs. Kennedy to Paris. It kind of reminds me of when, at a different level, when my son played basketball at Montana State, no one in the damn town knew my name. For 4 years I went by Carson's dad. That's what I went by. Nobody knew my name, but I was Carson's dad. Didn't have a name. Well, that's kind of what the point is here, is that she's more popular than he is, and so he becomes the man who accompanies her wherever she goes, because she's more popular. And so here's the wit. He says, ladies and gentlemen, 2 years ago, I said that, I introduced myself in Paris by saying that I was the man who accompanied Mrs. Kennedy to Paris. I'm getting somewhat that same sensation as I travel around Texas. And he pauses and gets that smile, and he goes, nobody wonders what Lyndon and I wear. Because women were wearing the same hairstyle and the same clothes that Jackie Kennedy wore. That she was a huge impact on this country. And he says, nobody wonders what Lyndon and I wear. Well, he concluded, he gave a long speech, but I want you to listen to his conclusion, and don't write it down again. And I want you just to think about what he's saying. He says, I don't think we are fatigued or tired. We would like to live as we lived, we'd like to live as we once lived, but history will not permit it. The communist balance of power is still strong. The balance of power is still on the side of freedom. We are still the keystone in the arc of freedom. And I think we continue to do what we have done in our past, our duty. And the people of Texas will be in the lead, so I am glad to come. So basically what he's stating is we can't live in the United States like we did 30 years ago. History's not going to permit it. We have the Cold War going on now. And the communist balance of power is still strong, but he still believes the balance of power is on the side of freedom, or the United States. It was a very good speech. Okay? At 9:50 then, a.m. that morning, at 9:50, what happens after you speak? What do people generally do? And we talked about this. Give him a gift. So at 9:50, he was presented with a 10-gallon cowboy hat by Raymond E. Buck. So after he got done with this speech, everybody clapped, like you said, and then they presented him with a 10-gallon cowboy hat, and it was given to him by Raymond E. Buck. Who do you think Raymond E. Buck might have been, if you think about this story in general? Who is he? Who's Raymond E. Buck? Why would he be the guy to give him a hat? If you guys give a gift to your graduation speaker this year, who's probably going to give it to him? President of the class. Okay? So, who do you think, think about who he's speaking for. Who's Raymond E. Buck? What is he? What's he the president of? Fort Worth Chamber of Commerce. Okay? Raymond E. Buck is the president of the Fort Worth Chamber of Commerce. So, what do you think the crowd did right away when they handed him that hat? Wanted him to put it on. Okay? Now, President Kennedy was an Easterner, very fine tailored Easterner. He sure as hell wasn't going to compromise his tailored Eastern look in the middle of cow country by putting on a hat that was going to make him look stupid in his mind, right? He wasn't going to do that in his mind. So before the crowd really got too wound up, he asked the chairman he asked Buck to put it on instead. He said, you put it on. And he did. Okay, Buck put it on. Well, he thought that'd get him off the hook. But the crowd continued to, come on, whatever, put the hat on. And he doesn't want to put it on. He doesn't want to look, he's the president. He doesn't want to look like a doofus. Because that's not going to match real well with what he's got on. So they continue to badger him a little bit in a positive way. And finally he says this. He went up to the microphone, he said, I'll put it on in the White House on Monday. If you come up there, you'll have a chance to see it then. And that was the end of it. He figured it out. He wasn't going to put it on. No way in the world. So with the crowd still urging him to put on the hat, he went to the microphone and stated, I'll put it on in the White House on Monday. If you come up there, you'll have a chance to see it then. Obviously, no one in the world was going to do that. Okay? Well, then he was presented his second gift. What do you think it was?
Wasn't it a doll?
What?
Wasn't it a doll?
No, that was in Tampa. What was he given after the cowboy hat?
Boots.
Pair of boots. They gave him a pair of cowboy boots. And this is what Raymond Buck said to the president when he handed him his cowboy boots. He said, and to protect you against local enemies in the manner you are protecting this nation against our foreign enemies, and to keep the rattlesnakes on Vice President Johnson's ranch from striking you, we want to present you with this pair of boots. And he looked at the president and he said, and we won't ask you to put them on. Here. In other words, he was kind of jabbing back that maybe he could put him on the White House when he got there. But anyway, he said, and to protect you against local enemies in the manner you are protecting this nation against our foreign enemies, and to keep the rattlesnakes on Vice President Johnson's ranch from striking you, we want to present you with this pair of boots. And then he shortly stated, he says, we won't ask you to put them on here, is what he said. Well, they gave the president a final prayer at the banquet, wishing him a safe trip just before he departed the grand ballroom. So they bowed their head in prayer, praying for the president. And I'm going to finish up with this great story. As they leave the Hotel Texas, they're shaking hands with people. And where did President Kennedy really want to go over and shake hands with? The Texas Boys Choir. So he walked over to the Texas Boys Choir, and he started to shake hands and thank them for their performance. And one of the guys he ran into was a 9-year-old by the name of Gary Bakewell. Gary Bakewell was one of the boys in the choir that the president ran into. Gary Bakewell. And I'm going to hurry through this and we'll repeat it tomorrow. I want you to hear it though. As the president shook Bakewell's hand, the 9-year-old said to the president, "Hi, my name's Gary Bakewell, and I'm Catholic." And the president looked at him, he said, "Well, I'm Catholic too." And the president then asked him what he wanted to be when he grew up, and he said, "I'm going to be a pilot." And to that answer, Kennedy reminded him that he better study his math and arithmetic if he was going to be a pilot and to do his homework. And the president ended it and went and visited with other people. Guess what Gary Bakewell grew up to be? A pilot. He did. And if you ever talk to Gary, he'd say that was a moment he would never forget. Okay, we'll continue on what the president does after he leaves the ballroom throughout Dallas. Okay, good job today.